Every 1,000 years, the gods gather in secret, and they decide whether humanity gets to live. This time, they voted for extinction. But something heard them, something that has spent 12,000 years hunting gods who sit up high and call it holy. And it is falling straight through the roof of heaven. They dressed a genocide up as a fair fight. He came to break their little game in half. The gods think their power is the final word. What if Asura's wrath entered record of Ragnarok? The story begins here.
The scoreboard hung over the arena like a second sun, 13 names carved in god steel, 13 more beneath them in mortal iron, and between the two columns a tally that the whole of creation had learned to read at a glance. 2 lights burned on the divine side, 2 burned on the human side. 4 rounds fought. 4 champions dead, 2 of them gods, and the sand had drunk enough blood to turn black in patches that no rain in Valhalla would ever wash clean. Round 5 had not yet been called. In the gods' stands, high above the killing ground, immortals lounged and feasted, and laughed the way only the deathless can laugh at death. They wore the shapes of every pantheon the mortal world had ever knelt to, thunder kings and sea tyrants, jackal-headed judges, radiant Olympians draped in gold, storm-eyed Easterners with blades longer than a man was tall. They had watched Thor break Lubu. They had watched their own king, Zeus, tear the first man apart with fists that could crack a world. They had watched Poseidon fall to a nameless swordsman, and Heracles fall to a killer who walked out of London's fog, and they had told themselves, each time, that it did not matter. 7 wins. That was all the divine needed. 7. And the vote would stand, and the human vermin would be scrubbed from the earth they had squatted on for far too long. The Valkyries knew the count better than anyone. Down at the arena's edge, in the shadow beneath the human stands, Brunhild, eldest of the 13 sisters, the woman who had defied all of heaven to force this trial into being, stood with her arms folded and her jaw set, watching the divine box the way a general watches the enemy line. 2 and 2, even. And the next round belonged by the order she and the gods had haggled over for a fortnight of Valhalla's endless days, to one of the mightiest destroyers ever to be worshipped by frightened men. She did not let it show on her face, but her hands, hidden in the crooks of her elbows, were closed into fists. "They will call the god of destruction next," said the smaller Valkyrie at her side. Gull, 13th and youngest, whose voice had a way of trembling when she tried hardest to keep it steady. "We have no one ready for him, not after Kojiro. He needs to rest, he needs." "I know what he needs," Brunhild said. "Quiet, final, and I know what we have." Which was nothing. That was the truth she carried like a stone in her chest, and would not set down where her sisters could see it. Humanity's champions were legends, every one, history's fiercest and finest, elevated by the Volunder into beings that could trade blows with gods. But legends were finite. They tired, they bled, they died, one to a round, and the divine had an eternity of monsters to spend against them. The arithmetic of Ragnarök had only ever run one way, and Brunhild had built her entire defiance on the desperate bet that will could beat arithmetic. She was still running the numbers in her head, still trying to make 5 rounds of loss come out to 7 wins, when the sky above the arena did something the sky above the arena had never once done in the whole span of the tournament. It split, not with thunder, not with the pageantry a god would have chosen. There was no herald, no chariot, no banner of flame announcing an arrival. There was simply a point of light, high up past the divine box, past the scoreboard, past the place where Valhalla's false heaven met its false horizon, a single hard point of white that had not been there a heartbeat before, and that grew, and grew, and did not stop growing. The gods noticed the way a crowd notices a wasp. A few heads turned, a few conversations paused. Someone in the Greek section laughed and said something about a shooting star, and asked whether they were meant to make a wish. The point of light resolved into a shape. The shape was falling. It came down not like a meteor. A meteor falls dumb, falls blind, obeys nothing but wait. This came down like a decision. It came down head first, with its arms flung back, and its whole body drawn into a spear of intent, aimed at the exact center of the sacred sand, as if the arena itself had done something to earn it. And in the last half-second, when it was close enough that even the immortals could make out limbs and a face, and the terrible red glow burning up out of it from the inside. The whole of Valhalla understood at the same instant that this was not a god any of them had summoned, and not a champion any Valkyrie had chosen, and not a thing that had any business existing inside the sealed and sacred boundary of Ragnarok at all. It hit the ground. The sound arrived a moment after the light. Later, the human historians who survived to write of it would argue about how to describe a noise that every one of them had felt in their teeth before they heard it in their ears. A single vast crack. The sound of the world's largest bell struck once and shattered in the striking. The sacred sand did not simply move. It fled, blasted outward in a ring, so perfect and so violent that gods in the front rows of the stands threw up their arms, and immortals 200 feet away felt the wind of it lift their hair. A crater opened where the center of the killing ground had been, a bowl of scorched black glass 30 feet across, and at the bottom of it, folded down on one knee, with one fist buried to the wrist in the earth, was a man. He was not large, by the standards of the beings in the stands. Zeus was a mountain of muscle. Heracles had been a wall of it. Even the human champions carried themselves as things carved from something harder than flesh. This one was lean, bare to the waist, banded with lean, hard muscle and older scars, black hair falling loose around a face set in an expression that had nothing of fear in it, and nothing of awe. His eyes, when he lifted his head, were the red of a forge left burning, and from the joints of his arms, from his shoulders and his spine, the same red light bled up through his skin in veins and cracks, pulsing, as if the man were a vessel with something furnace sealed inside him, and the seal was not quite holding. He straightened out of the crater. He looked at the sky he had fallen through, then down at the black glass under his feet, then up, slowly, deliberately, at the tiered box where the assembled gods of every human faith sat staring back at him. And the first thing the being did, the very first thing, before a single word had been spoken to him, or by him, was set his jaw and let out a low sound from somewhere deep in his chest that was not a shout and was not a growl but was, unmistakably, the sound of a man looking at something that disgusted him. If you're the sort who lives for exactly this, a fighter who fits no one's rules crashing a contest built to keep him out, then do the thing that keeps stories like this coming. Subscribe, and drop me the next crossover you want to see. Any universe, any character. Name the world and name the fighter, and it goes in the pot. Written by me, fueled by you. Now, back down onto the sand, where the gods have just realized the falling star has fists. For a long moment, nobody in all of Valhalla said anything. It was Brunhild who moved first, because she was the only one in the arena whose entire life was built on the arrival of the unexpected, and because a Valkyrie's instinct in the presence of raw power was not to flinch from it but to measure it. She stepped out from the shadow of the human stands into the open, out onto the ruined sand, closer to the crater than good sense would have allowed, and she felt the thing before she was halfway there. Heat. Not the heat of a fire, the heat of pressure, of something so full of force that being near it was like standing beside a dam and feeling the whole weight of the held-back river through the stone. Her Valkyrie senses, the same senses that let her sisters read a champion's soul and forge themselves into the weapon that soul required, reached toward the man in the crater the way they reached toward everyone, and recoiled. It was not that he was empty. He was the opposite of empty. It was that where a human champion had a soul she could read like a page, and where a god had a nature she could name and place within the great order of things. This one had a furnace, a roaring, bottomless, upward spiraling engine of something that the Old Norse tongue had no clean word for, though the oldest tongues of the mortal world did. Wrath, not anger, which comes and goes. Wrath as a substance. Wrath as the thing he was made of and ran on and would, she understood with a cold certainty, never run out of, because the more of it he spent, the more of it he seemed to have. She had come out onto the sand meaning to challenge him, to demand in the old ritual way what he was and by what right he stood on the ground of Ragnarok. She found, when she opened her mouth, that a different question came out. "What did they do to you?" Brunhild said quietly. "To make you like this?" The man's red eyes moved to her. Some fraction of the fury in them banked, just slightly, the way a fire banks when a wind briefly turns, not because it has cooled, but because for one moment it has something other than fuel to consider. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has, unexpectedly, asked the right thing. But before he could answer, the gods found their voices. They found them, as gods always do, in the mode of outrage. A dozen immortals were on their feet in the divine box, and the sound coming down off the tears had gone in an instant from bafflement to fury of its own. The fury of the deathless at the intolerable rudeness of a thing that had entered their contest without asking. Voices in the tongues of 100 vanished civilizations demanded to know what this was, who had permitted it, why the barrier of the arena, the sacred seal that no unsanctioned power was meant to cross, had let it through. One god, huge and gold and thunder-browed, took a step to the front rail and gripped it in a hand that could palm a mountain, and the whole stand went quiet under the weight of who he was. Zeus, king of the Olympians, the Almighty, the being who had opened the whole tournament by tearing the first man of all creation limb from limb, looked down at the stranger in the crater with the patient contempt of a landlord regarding vermin in his hall. "You," he said, and his voice rolled across the arena like weather, "are not on the roster." The man on the sand looked up at the king of the gods. The banked fire in his eyes came back up to full. And when he spoke, the first words he had said in Valhalla, in a voice rough as a landslide and utterly without deference, every soul in the stands, divine and mortal alike, understood that whatever the rules of Ragnarok were, this creature had never in his existence agreed to be bound by a single one of them. "No," Asura said, "I'm not." He rose fully to his feet, and the red light in his veins pulsed brighter, and he swept his gaze once across the entire assembled majesty of heaven, the gold and the thunder, the tiered thousands of the deathless, the great carved scoreboard tallying the murder of a species by ceremony, and something in the set of his shoulders said he had seen all of it before, in one form or another, and had already decided exactly what it was worth. "But I've killed things like you before," he said, "and I'll do it again." The word "killed" landed in the divine stands and detonated. 10,000 immortal voices rose at once, some in outrage, some in genuine offense, and a few, from the sharper minds scattered through the pantheons, in something that was not quite laughter and not quite unease. Because a god could be insulted by a mortal. That happened. A god could be defied by a champion. That was the entire point of this trial. But there was a specific way this thing had said things like "you." Flat, factual, the tone of a man naming a job he had done and would do again. That did not sound like the boast of a lesser being reaching above itself. It sounded like a professional identifying his work. Down at the sand's edge, Brunhild had gone very still. Around her, the youngest of her sisters had crept out to sea, and Gull's hand had found her arm, and was gripping it hard enough to bruise, and Brunhild let her, because she was doing the same arithmetic she always did, and for the first time in the whole doomed run of Ragnarök, the arithmetic had a variable in it she could not solve. 2 and 2, round 5 uncalled, a god of destruction waiting in the wings to make it 3. And now, falling out of a sky that had never opened before, kneeling in a crater of its own making, radiating a wrath that her own Valkyrie soul had flinched from touching, a thing that belonged to no column on the board. Not a god, not one of humanity's 13, not a weapon any Valkyrie had forged or ever could forge. A wildcard, in the oldest and most dangerous sense of the word, a card that did not fit the deck, a card that, dealt into a game whose every rule the gods had written to favor themselves, threatened not to lose the game but to overturn the entire table. High in the divine box, Zeus's knuckles whitened on the rail, and somewhere further back in the tiers of heaven, in the section where the eastern gods kept their own council, a four-armed figure who had been watching the whole thing with his chin propped on one fist and a slow grin spreading across his face, finally leaned forward, interested at last, the way a hunter leans forward when the woods deliver something worth the hunt. But that was a moment still to come. For now there was only the crater and the falling star that had turned out to have fists, and a demigod of wrath standing at the center of the god's own arena, with the red light bleeding up out of his skin, telling the assembled majesty of every heaven mankind had ever built, without raising his voice, that he had come to a contest about whether humanity deserved to live, and that he intended to answer the question with his hands. The gods did what gods do. When the world hands them something they did not order, they convened. It happened fast, and it happened above the arena, in the great floating gallery, where the ruling powers of the pantheons gathered between rounds to argue the shape of the tournament. One moment Zeus stood at the rail with his knuckles white on the god steel. The next, the air over the divine box thickened and folded, and a ring of thrones took shape in the empty sky, a parliament of the deathless, convened in the space of a held breath, because when immortals decide a thing must be discussed, the discussing does not wait on stairs. They left Asura standing in his crater. That was deliberate. To summon him would have been to grant him standing, and standing was the one thing the divine order refused to grant a thing that had no line on the board. So they rose above him and left him below, a lone red-lit figure in a bowl of black glass, and they debated him the way a council of surgeons might debate a growth, with distaste, with authority, and with the settled assumption that the thing being discussed had no say in what was decided about it. The seal held for 4 rounds, said a god with the head of a jackal, and a voice like sand pouring over stone. Anubis, the weigher of hearts, and his black eyes were fixed downward on the crater with a scholar's cold attention. It has never once failed. No unsanctioned power crosses the boundary of Ragnarok. That is the covenant. That is what makes this trial a trial, and not a brawl. He turned the long dark muzzle toward Zeus, and yet it crossed, which means one of 2 things. Either the seal was broken, or the seal did not recognize what came through as a power at all. It is standing in a crater it made with its body, rumbled a broad thunder god from the northern thrones. Not Thor, who was elsewhere and sharpening something, but one of his kin, red-bearded and heavy-browed. I think we can rule out not a power. Can we? Anubis did not raise his voice. The seal reads the nature of a thing. A god it knows. A Valkyrie's forging it knows. A mortal champion carrying a Volander it knows. It admits what belongs and refuses what does not. His muzzle tilted. It did not refuse this. Ask yourselves why. Ask yourselves what a thing must be for the covenant of heaven to look at it and find no category to bar it under. A murmur went through the ring of thrones. It was not a comfortable murmur. From the eastern seats, where the Hindu and Buddhist powers kept their own council apart from the Western clamor, a voice cut in, light, amused, entirely unbothered by the mood in the gallery. The 4-armed god had followed the parliament up into the sky, and now sat sprawled across a throne too small to hold his enthusiasm, one leg thrown over an armrest, his 4 hands variously occupied with a goblet, a length of prayer beads, and 2 fists resting easy on his knees. Shiva, the destroyer, wore the grin of a man at a festival that had just gotten interesting. "You're all asking the wrong question," Shiva said. "You keep asking what is it and how did it get in? Boring questions. Bureaucrat questions." He took a long pull from the goblet and jabbed one of his free hands down toward the crater. The interesting question is, it fell out of the sky aiming at the middle of the arena. It didn't wander in. It didn't slip through a gap. It picked this place, out of all the world, and it came down like a fist. That's not an accident crossing a seal. That's a challenge, walking up to a door. "It is a contamination," snapped a goddess further along the ring, regal, cold, jeweled in gold. Her contempt so total it had gone past heat into something glacial. Ragnarok is the most sacred contest in the history of creation. 13 duels, 13 champions, a rule for every stroke. And you would have us treat a thing that fell through the roof as a challenger. She turned to Zeus, and her voice sharpened to a command. "Remove it. You are the Almighty. Reach down, take it in your fist, and put it back on the other side of the seal where it belongs. Let the tournament proceed." Round 5 was to be called. Call it, and let this be forgotten. And for a moment it seemed that was how it would go. Zeus rose from his throne, and when Zeus rose, the gallery quieted, because the being who had opened this whole trial by tearing the first man into red ruin did not need to argue a point he could simply enforce. He looked down at the crater and the lean, scarred figure standing in it, and there was no hatred in his face, which was somehow worse than hatred. There was only the mild, absolute confidence of a landlord who has decided a pest has been indulged long enough. He raised one hand. The air around it hardened. the faint sheen of Adamus, the divine tempering that turned a god's fist into a thing that could crack the shell of a world. And a pressure came down on the arena like the underside of a mountain lowering onto the sand. It was not a blow. It was barely a gesture. It was Zeus reaching down with a fraction of himself to close his fingers around an inconvenience and set it outside. The pressure hit Asura and stopped. Not slowed, not resisted with strain. Stopped, the way a falling weight stops when it lands on stone, because the stone was simply there and simply did not move. The demigod had not braced, he had not lifted a hand. He stood in his crater with the god pressure of the Almighty bearing down on the whole of Valhalla and looked up through it, red eyes narrowing, and the only thing that changed about him was that the light bleeding out of his veins pulsed one shade brighter. In the divine gallery, the smile fell off the cold goddess's face. Zeus felt it. Of course he felt it. He was the one reaching, and he was the one whose reach had closed on something that gave back nothing. His brow lowered a fraction. He pressed harder, and the sand around the crater compressed and cracked in rings, and the human stands groaned under the weight of it, and champions who had killed gods gritted their teeth against a force that was not even aimed at them. And at the bottom of the crater, the lean, red-lit figure rolled his shoulders once, as a man rolls his shoulders under a load he has decided to ignore, and did not move an inch. "Interesting," said Shiva, very softly, and now he was sitting up straight. Zeus lowered his hand. The pressure lifted. It lifted. The watching Valkyries all understood, because the king of the gods had chosen to lift it rather than escalate, because to escalate here, now, in front of the entire parliament of heaven, against a thing that had shrugged off his casual dismissal, would be to admit that the matter was no longer casual, and a king does not admit that. A king withdraws his hand and calls it a decision. "It has some durability," Zeus said, as if reporting a minor finding, and settled back onto his throne. But the murmur that ran the Ring of Thrones this time had a different note in it, and everyone in the gallery heard the note, and Zeus heard them hear it. Down on the sand, Asura finally spoke, and though he pitched his rough landslide voice no louder than a man speaking across a room, it carried up into the gallery of the gods with perfect, insolent clarity, because Valhalla had gone silent enough to let it. "You reached down to move me," he said, "like I was a stone in your garden." He turned his head slowly, taking in the whole ring of floating thrones, the whole assembled majesty, debating his disposal above his head. 7 million years you've done this. Sat up high, looked down, decided which things get to live and which things get swept out. The red in his eyes came up hotter. "I know your kind. I've met your kind. You dress it up different every time. A covenant, a trial, 13 fair duels. Oh, how generous. But underneath the dressing, it's always the same thing. It's always you deciding you have the right." "We have the right," the cold goddess said, and there was real venom in it now, because the thing had struck a nerve she had not known was exposed. "We are gods. The right to judge is the whole of what we—" "You have the power," Asura said. "That's not the same thing. I've got power too." He lifted one hand, not to strike, just to look at it, turning it over, the red light webbing through the knuckles. "Doesn't make me right. Doesn't make you right. It just means when you decide to wipe out everything down there." He tipped his head toward the human stands, toward the mortal thousands packed in the shadow beneath the gods. "The only thing that can tell you no is something with a bigger fist." He closed the hand. "So here I am." And that, more than the crater, more than shrugging off the Almighty's grip, was the thing that changed the shape of the day. Because up in the human stands, 10,000 mortals who had come to Valhalla to watch their champions die had just heard a being that fell out of the sky look up at the gods deciding their extinction and say no on their behalf. Not as a champion sworn to a Valkyrie, not as a piece on the board, as a thing that had simply arrived, uninvited and unfitting, and planted itself between the executioner and the condemned, because it had seen this exact execution before, and could not stand to watch it again. Brunhild felt the mood take hold of the human tears, like a tide coming in. She knew the danger of it better than anyone. Hope was a weapon that could cut the hand that held it, and false hope worst of all. She had built the entire desperate architecture of Ragnarok on channeling humanity's will into 13 champions and 13 forged sisters, on rules, on a structure the gods had been forced to honor. And now here was a thing that honored none of it, that had appointed itself to a fight no one had granted it, and the crowd was falling in love with it the way a drowning man falls in love with any floating thing. He belongs to nothing, Gul breathed at her shoulder. The youngest Valkyrie's eyes were wide, fixed on the crater. Sister, I reached for him, the way we reach for the champions, to see what weapon he'd need. And there's nothing to forge, nothing to merge with. He isn't a fighter who needs a Volunder. Her voice dropped. He's already the weapon, all the way down. He doesn't need us. He doesn't need the rules. He doesn't need any of it. I know, Brunhild said. And she did. She had felt it the moment she stepped out onto the sand, the furnace where a soul should be, the thing her forging sense had flinched from because there was no seam in it to work, no shape a Valkyrie could pour herself into and improve. Every champion humanity had fielded was a legend made greater by a sister's sacrifice, mortal will amplified by divine steel. This one was not amplified by anything. This one had come pre-forged in a fire she did not recognize and could not have lit. And the terrible, vertiginous truth of it was that he sat entirely outside the machine she had built to fight the gods, which meant he was outside her control as thoroughly as he was outside theirs. A wild card. She turned the old word over in her mind and did not like the weight of it. In the games mortals played to pass their short lives, the wild card was the card that fit no suit, that could stand for anything or nothing, that a clever player kept back for the moment the whole game hung in the balance. It won games. It also, when the deck did not expect it, broke them, turned a contest with rules into a contest with none, and left everyone at the table staring at a board that no longer made sense. The gods, up in their ring of thrones, had arrived at the same understanding by a colder road. Anubis said it first, because Anubis was the one whose entire nature was the sorting of things into their proper places, and it was Anubis who felt most keenly the wrongness of a thing that could not be sorted. It cannot be removed, the jackal god said, and the flatness of his voice made the gallery listen. Zeus has shown us that, not without a true escalation, and a true escalation, here, before the trial is done, sets a precedent none of us wants. It cannot be ignored. The mortals have already taken it into their hearts, and to leave it standing in our arena unanswered is to let it mean something to them. His black eyes swept the ring, and it cannot be admitted as a champion, for it swore no oath, and carries no Valkyrie, and answers to no side of the board. The muzzle turned, at last, toward the eastern thrones, toward the four-armed god who had been sitting forward this whole while, with his grin widening by the minute, which leaves us exactly one road. If it will not be moved, and cannot be ignored, and does not fit the board, then it must be met. On the sand, by one of us, and made an example of, so thoroughly and so publicly that every mortal watching learns the lesson the seal was meant to teach, that the powers of heaven are not a thing you challenge by falling through the roof. The silence in the gallery held for one beat, two. And then Shiva laughed, a big, delighted, rolling laugh, all four arms thrown wide, and he stood from his too small throne with the eagerness of a boy called to play. Well, the god of destruction said, grinning down at the red-lit figure in the crater far below, it was going to be my round anyway. He looked around the ring of thrones, and none of them moved to stop him, because round 5 was his by the order they had haggled over, and because there was not a power in the Western pantheons that wanted to be the one to climb down onto the sand and test personally whether the thing's durability had a bottom. Call it, Shiva said, and cracked all 4 sets of knuckles at once, a sound like a rock slide starting. Round 5, change of opponent. I'll take the one that fell out of the sky. His grin sharpened into something with teeth in it, not cruelty exactly, but the pure, bottomless hunger of a being whose whole divine purpose was to bring things to their end, and who had just been shown, for the first time in an age, something that might actually be worth ending. Let's find out how angry it can get before it breaks. Far below, in his bowl of black glass, Asura lifted his head toward the eastern thrones. toward the one voice in all that gallery that had not spoken of him as a stain to be scrubbed, but as a fight to be had. And for the first time since he had fallen through the roof of heaven, something crossed the demigod's scarred face that was not contempt. It was recognition. The naming of the round did not settle the arena. It unsettled it further. Word of it went down through the tiers the way fire goes down a dry hill, from the Ring of Thrones to the divine box, from the divine box to the god's stands, and then, carried on the great voice of the tournament's herald, down at last to the mortal thousands packed into the shadow beneath heaven. Round 5. The god of destruction, against the thing that fell out of the sky. Not a champion, not one of the 13. A challenger the gods themselves had been forced to acknowledge by climbing down to meet him, because they could not lift him out. In the human stands, the meaning of that landed before the words had finished echoing. The gods had made a rule for everything. 13 and 13, first to 7. A Valkyrie for every champion, a champion for every round. The whole vast machine of the trial built so that even humanity's victories happened inside a frame the divine had approved. And now the machine had a thing in it that the frame did not contain, and rather than remove it, the gods had chosen to fight it, which was the same as admitting they could not simply set it aside. That admission did something to the crowd that no champion's victory had quite managed. Kojiro beating Poseidon had been triumph. Jack beating Heracles had been triumph. But triumph inside the rules still belonged, somehow, to the gods. It was a game the gods had allowed, and a game the gods could still win 7 times over. This was different. This was a thing that had walked in from outside the game entirely and made the gods deal with it on its terms. And for the mortals watching, that outsideness was the most intoxicating thing they had ever seen. It suggested, for the first time in 7 million years, that the rules the gods had written might not be the only rules there were. Brunhild watched the intoxication spread through her people and felt the ground shift under everything she had built. She had climbed to the lip of the human stands, up where the mortal tiers met the boundary of the sand, and from there she could see all of it at once, the crater and its lone red figure, the divine box seething above, her sisters clustered pale and tense in the shadows below, and the ocean of human faces turned toward the demigod with an expression she had spent her long unlife trying and failing to put on them. Not hope, exactly. Hope she knew. Hope she had fed them in careful ration doses for 4 rounds. This was bigger and more dangerous than hope. This was permission, the sense that the fence around their fate had a hole in it, and something had come through the hole. "You're afraid of him," said a voice beside her. She did not turn. She had felt the old god arrive, the shift in the air that came with Buddha, who had scandalized all of heaven by taking humanity's side, and who wandered the tournament with a popsicle in one hand and an air of infuriating calm that concealed one of the most dangerous minds in all of creation. He leaned on the rail beside her, robes loose, and looked down at the crater with mild eyes. "I'm afraid of what he does to them," Brunhild said. "Look at them. 2 days ago they cheered a swordsman who died to give us 1 point. Now they've forgotten the swordsman. They're not cheering a champion anymore. They're cheering a..." She searched for it. "A break in the wall. And when the god of destruction puts him down, and the wall is whole again, what do I do with a crowd that's tasted the outside? You assume the wall gets put back. Buddha." She did turn now. "It's Shiva. You've watched him. You know what he is." "I do." The old god took a slow bite of the popsicle, unhurried, as if the fate of the species were a matter for a lazy afternoon. "And I watched the Almighty reach down to flick that thing off the board like a beetle, and I watched the beetle not move." He tipped his head toward the crater. "You reached for his soul, didn't you? To forge him, like your sisters do. There was nothing to hold. Nothing you could forge." Buddha corrected gently. "That's not the same as nothing. You've never met his kind because his kind aren't in your ledgers. Not the gods and not yours. He isn't a champion your Volander makes into a god killer. He came off the anvil that way, in a forge that isn't in this heaven, or any other you and I know." He finished the popsicle and considered the bare stick with something like affection. "Which means whatever Shiva thinks he's about to do down there, he's testing an assumption none of us can check. And I've lived a very long time, Valkyrie. The most dangerous words in all of creation are, I know exactly what this is." Down on the sand, The thing they were discussing had turned his back on the whole of heaven. Asura had climbed out of his crater, not scrambling, just stepping up out of the bowl of black glass as though a 30-foot pit were a low curb, and he had walked to the edge of the human stands, to the place where the boundary between the killing ground and the mortal tiers ran, and he stood there now looking up at the faces looking down at him. 10,000 of them, frightened, exhausted, 4 rounds deep into watching their finest die one at a time to buy a fraction of a chance. He looked at them for a long moment, and the red light in his veins dimmed, banked low, the way it had when Brunhild asked her question, the fire finding, briefly, something other than fuel to consider. "Is this all of you?" he said, not loud. The nearest 100 heard it and went silent, and the silence spread back through the tears. "That's left, that they let watch." A muscle worked in his jaw. "The rest of your kind, the billions of you, down on the earth, they don't even know this is happening, do they? They're living their little lives. Eating, working, loving, dying, never knowing that up here a room full of gods voted them into a slaughterhouse and gave them 13 chances to talk their way out. No one answered. No one had to." "I know that feeling," Asura said, and something in the roughness of his voice had gone quiet and terrible. "Knowing, when no one else does. Watching the ones who decide sit up high and comfortable, calling it order, calling it balance, calling it the way of things, while down below, the ones they've decided about just keep on living, trusting that the world is fair." His hands closed slowly into fists. "It isn't. I learned that the hard way. Everything I ever trusted looked down at me from a high place just like that one." His head jerked toward the divine box without his eyes leaving the human stands, and it decided I was fuel. It decided the people I loved were fuel. And it dressed the decision up in words so pretty that everyone nodded along and called it holy. The red light in his veins came back up, not banked now, rising. "So no," he said, "I'm not one of your 13. I didn't come here for your tournament. I don't care about your score or your rules or your best of 13. He turned, at last, away from the human stands and toward the arena, toward the eastern thrones where a 4-armed god was descending on a stairway of light with a grin on his face. "I came because I heard the same words I've heard my whole curse existence. We have decided. We have the right." His voice dropped to something that reached every corner of Valhalla without being raised at all. "And every single time I hear those words, out of the mouth of something that calls itself a god, I want to break its jaw." In the divine box, the cold goddess's lip curled. In the human stands, 10,000 mortals discovered that they had stopped breathing. And up on the lip of the tears, Buddha said quietly, to Brunhild, "There it is. That's what your seal didn't recognize. Not a power, a grievance. An old one and a true one, and one that a heaven very much like ours, already earned once and never paid for." He watched the 4-armed god's feet touch the sand. "He's not here to win your tournament, Valkyrie. He's here to send a bill, and the god of destruction just volunteered to be the first name on it." Shiva reached the sand. He came across it without hurry, 4 arms loose, that festival grin fixed in place. And where Asura was lean and scarred and burning, Shiva was massive and easy and delighted, a god at the peak of his powers, the destroyer whose whole cosmic office was to bring the dance of existence to its ending, so that a new dance could begin. He stopped a dozen paces from the demigod and looked him up and down with frank, hungry appreciation, the way a swordsman looks at a blade he has heard about for years and finally gets to hold. "You," Shiva said, "are the most interesting thing to walk into this arena since the trial began. Do you know that? The Almighty put a mountain on you and you rolled your shoulders." He laughed, genuinely pleased. "Everyone up there is terrified of you. The jackal wants to catalog you. The cold ones want you gone. And none of them will say the real thing out loud." He spread all 4 arms, expansive, delighted. "So I'll say it. Nobody knows what happens when they hit you as hard as they can. Isn't that wonderful? A whole heaven of gods, and not one of them knows." He cracked his knuckles again. That rock slide sound. "I intend to find out." "You'll find out," Asura agreed. The red light webbed brighter through his arms. "They think I'm doing this to make an example of you." Shiva rolled his neck, loosening, 4 shoulders settling into a stance. "To scrub the stain, teach the mortals their lesson. put the wall back up, and I'll let them think it, because it keeps the cold ones happy." His grin widened, and for just a moment something ancient and honest showed through the festival mask. The pure, uncomplicated love of a fight. The one thing a god of endings and a demigod of wrath might actually share. But you and me, we both know that's not why. I'm doing this because for the first time in longer than I can remember, I get to hit something with everything I have and not know if it'll be enough. He settled the last inch into his stance, 4 fists rising. That's the best gift anyone's given me in an age. So let's not disappoint each other. Asura raised his own fists. The scars on his forearms glowed. Behind him, the human stands had gone utterly, breathlessly silent. Above him, the whole parliament of heaven leaned forward on its thrones. Beside her, Brunhild felt Buddha go very still, all his lazy calm dropping away at once, because the old god had watched 1,000 fights and knew the exact quality of the quiet that comes right before the ones that matter. "Don't worry," the demigod of wrath said, and the fire in him rose and did not stop rising. "I never do." The two of them stood in the center of the arena, the god of destruction and the thing that fit no side of the board, and for one last held instant, nothing in all of Valhalla moved. The scoreboard hung overhead, 2-2. Round 5 uncalled no longer. And then, without a signal, without a bell, without any of the ceremony the gods loved so well, they moved at the same instant, and the sand between them ceased, in a single thunderclap, to exist. The first exchange lasted less than a heartbeat and rewrote the arena. They met at the center of the sand, Shiva crossing the distance in a blur that left 4 afterimages, Asura closing it in a straight red line, and where they met, the air itself gave up. There was no gradual build, no testing of range, no circling. 4 fists and 2 collided in the same instant, a dozen impacts stacked into a single point of space and a single sliver of time, and the sound that came out of it was not a sound anymore but a pressure, a flat wall of force that blasted outward in every direction and knocked the front rows of the divine box back into their seats. The remaining sand in the arena did not scatter. It left, lifted off the ground in a single sheet and hurled to the walls, so that in the space of that first exchange, the killing ground went from a bed of sand to a floor of bare scorched bedrock, swept clean by the shockwave of 2 beings' opening blows. And then they were apart again, 10 paces separated, and both of them were grinning. Nobody in the stands had followed it. That was the first thing the watching gods understood, and it frightened the proud ones more than the crater had. These were immortals who had watched Thor and Lu Bu trade blows too fast for mortal sight. They were not novices at speed, but the champions moved at the speed of forged things, human will amplified by Valkyrie steel, to the threshold where a god could be touched. This was something else. This was 2 beings for whom that threshold was a floor, hammering at each other above it, and even the deathless in the stands caught only the aftermath, the swept sand, the cracked bedrock, the 2 grinning figures already resetting for the next pass. "He kept up," said Anubis, in the Ring of Thrones, and there was no scholarly detachment in it now. With Shiva's opening speed, he kept up. Down on the bedrock, Shiva shook out one of his 4 hands, flexing the fingers, examining them with open delight. "That connected," he said, "the one to your ribs. That should have folded you around it." He looked at the demigod with real hungry wonder. "You didn't even shift your weight. What are you made of?" "Wrath," Asura said. And then, because Shiva had asked, and because the old god deserved to understand what he had chosen to fight, the story came. Not told aloud, for there was no time for telling, but surging up out of the demigod the way it always did when the fighting started, rising into his blood and his fists, and the red light webbing through his scars. Backstory was not a pause in a fight like this. It was the fuel. And up on the lip of the stands, Buddha closed his eyes for a moment, because he could feel it coming off the demigod in waves. The shape of a life, the shape of the grievance the seal had failed to recognize, and even the old god of the East, who had heard the sorrows of 10,000 worlds, found the shape of this one hard to bear. There had been a heaven once, not this one, a distant one, gold and radiant, and utterly convinced of its own righteousness, and Asura had served it, one of its 8 guardian generals. a demigod raised up to defend the mortal world below from the demons that gnawed at its edges. He had believed. That was the part that still burned hottest, the part the wrath fed on. He had believed. He had a wife he loved and a daughter he adored, and a place among the mighty, and a cause he thought was just, and he had given all of himself to the defending of the small and the mortal, trusting that the ones above him defended the same thing for the same reasons. They did not. The gods of that golden heaven had discovered a truth about the mortal world they ruled, that human souls, the prayers and faith and suffering of the countless small lives below, could be harvested, refined into power, mantra, the raw stuff of divinity, and used to make gods stronger, to wage their endless war on their own terms. The mortals were not a people to be protected. They were a crop, and everything the golden heaven called holy, the defending, the war, the sacred order, the beautiful pretty words, was the dressing on a machine that farmed the very souls it claimed to shield. When Asura learned it, he did what he was made to do. He raged, and so they broke him. His fellow generals, his brothers in arms, the ones he'd bled beside, turned on him at a word from above. They murdered his wife. They took his daughter, whose faith and purity made her the perfect priestess, the perfect engine, and they chained her to the harvesting machine to be drained across 12,000 years, while the gods above called it destiny. And Asura himself they cast down, stripped, betrayed, hurled from heaven into the mortal world below with a curse on him, left to rot, so that no inconvenient voice would trouble the harvest. He had not rotted. That was the thing the golden heaven had not counted on. They had thrown a demigod of wrath into the deepest pit they could find, and assumed the fall would end him, and instead, the fall had taught him that everything he'd believed was a lie, that every high and shining thing that called itself holy was a thief with good posture, and that the one force in all creation that a lie of that size could not extinguish was a rage large enough to match it. He had climbed back up out of the pit, not once, over and over, across ages, dying and returning, each betrayal and each loss stoking the fire hotter, until the wrath stopped being an emotion he felt and became the substance he was made of, a thing that grew, that fed on being struck down, that got stronger every single time a god decided he should stay in the dirt. That was what Shiva had chosen to hit, not a fighter, a grievance 12,000 years deep against the exact kind of being that sat, right now, in the ring of thrones above the sand, deciding the fate of a species, and calling it holy. You harvest them, Asura said, aloud now, low, and it was not really to Shiva, it was to all of them, to the whole watching majesty of heaven. Maybe not the way mine did. Maybe you don't grind their souls up for fuel, but you sit up there and you vote, every 1,000 years, is it? On whether the billions of them get to keep breathing. And when you decided the answer was no, you built this. He swept one glowing arm at the arena, the scoreboard, the whole apparatus of the trial, so you could feel fair about it. 13 duels, a sporting chance. You dressed up an execution as a game, and you told yourselves it made you just. The red in his eyes was a furnace now. I have heard that exact lie before, in a heaven prettier than yours, and I have made it my entire existence to find every heaven that tells it, and break it open. For a moment, even Shiva did not grin. The god of destruction stood on the swept bedrock and looked at the thing he had volunteered to fight, and something passed behind his ancient eyes. Not fear. Shiva did not have the shape for fear, but a kind of recognition, and under the recognition something almost like respect. He had come down to the sand for the joy of hitting something that might not break. He was beginning to understand that he had walked into something with a reason, and that a thing with a reason like this one's did not stop when it was hurt. It got stronger. Ah, Shiva said softly. All 4 arms flexed. The grin came back, but it was a different grin now. The grin of a god who has just realized the fight he wanted is going to be even bigger than he'd dared hope, and who is glad of it, and a little bit awed. You're not going to run out, are you? Most things, you hit them enough, they run out. Their strength has a bottom, that's what makes them breakable. He settled deeper into his 4-armed stance, and the air around his fists began to shimmer with the heat of gathering divine power, the true power, the destruction he had been holding in reserve behind the festival smile. But you don't have a bottom. The more I hurt you, the more there is of you. He laughed, and it rang off the walls of Valhalla, delighted and terrible. "Do you have any idea how long I've waited for something I can't run out of?" "Then stop holding back," Asura said. The scars up his arms flared white-red. Behind him, though he could not see it, the human stands had risen to their feet as one, 10,000 mortals on the edge of a thing they had no word for. Above him, the Ring of Thrones had gone silent and rigid, because the gods had sent Shiva down to make an example, and were watching. Instead, an example being made of the very idea that their power was the final word. "Hit me with all of it, everything you've got, every last piece of what makes you the god of destruction." He raised his fists. The red light poured off him now, pouring up into the false sky of Valhalla like a beacon, and for one instant, the shape behind the man showed through, vast, and many-armed, and burning, the thing the wrath was building toward. "I want to feel it," the demigod of wrath said, "when it isn't enough." And Shiva, god of destruction, threw back his head and roared with joy, and brought all four fists up, wreathed in the true fire of his office. And the second exchange began, and this one did not end in a heartbeat. Shiva stopped holding back, and Valhalla learned what the god of destruction had been carrying behind his smile. The change was not gradual. Between one breath and the next, the easy festival ease dropped away, and what stood on the bedrock was the raw cosmic office itself, the destroyer, the ender of cycles, the god whose dance shakes worlds apart so that new worlds can be born from the pieces. His four arms blurred into more than four, a fan of afterimages that were not tricks of speed, but the sheer number of angles from which he could strike at once. And the divine fire that wreathed his fists went from heat shimmer to something with weight and hunger in it, a fire that did not burn a thing so much as unmake it, that reached for the fundamental fact of a thing's existence, and pulled. He came at Asura with all of it. The exchange that followed could not be watched from the stands as a sequence of blows, because it was not a sequence, it was a storm, a continuous roll of impacts, stacked so densely that the sound never resolved into individual strikes, but held as one unbroken roar, the way a war does not sound like separate gunshots from far enough away. What the watching gods saw was the effect of it. The bedrock of the arena cratering and recratering in overlapping rings, the false sky above Valhalla flickering as the shockwaves reached it, the boundary walls of the tournament grounds, walls the seal had reinforced against any force from within, spider-webbing with cracks for the first time in the trial's history. And at the center of it, two figures, one massive and many-armed and wreathed in unmaking fire, one lean and scarred and burning red, trading destruction and wrath in a blur that the eye could only catch in flashes. A flash, Shiva's four fists landing on Asura at once, chest and jaw and both flanks, the unmaking fire pouring in. A flash, Asura taking it, not blocking, not dodging, taking all four blows on his body and driving his own fist up through the storm into the god of destruction's guard. A flash, the two of them at the center of a sphere of blasted air, faces inches apart, both grinning through blood. "There it is," Shiva breathed, delighted, in the eye of his own storm. "There it is." Because Asura's face, where the unmaking fire had raked across it, was not unmarked. The destroyer's power was real, and it had scored him, opened him, and the demigod bled. But the blood ran red and hot down a face that was smiling, and the wounds the unmaking fire opened were not spreading the way they should, not pulling the demigod apart the way they pulled everything else. They were closing, slowly, and against the grain of a power built to ensure things stayed ended, but closing. "You can hurt me," Asura said. He drove Shiva back a step with a blow that cracked the bedrock in a fresh ring. "Good, I was starting to worry." "Worry?" "That you'd be like the last ones." The demigod pressed in, and now the storm shifted, the momentum of it swinging toward the red figure for the first time. "The gods I've broken. Most of them, when it comes down to it, they're soft. All that power, and no one's ever really made them use it. They break the first time something hits back." His fists hammered into Shiva's crossed arms, and the god of destruction gave ground, and gave it again. "You're not soft. You've been ended before. I can feel it on you. You know what it is to lose." The red light flared. "That makes you worth the trouble." It was the truest thing anyone had said to Shiva in an age, and the god of destruction laughed even as he was driven back. because it was true. He was the ender, but he was also the danced upon, the god who understood better than any other in that ring of thrones that every ending is only a turn in a wheel, that he himself had been unmade and remade more times than the proud Western gods had ever risked being touched. And so where a lesser god would have panicked at being pushed back on the sand in front of all of heaven, Shiva only bared his teeth and leaned in, meeting the wrath with a joy that matched it. Two beings who had both been thrown down, and both refused to stay down, hammering at each other in the center of a ruined arena for the entertainment of a heaven that was slowly, throne by throne, ceasing to be entertained. Because the gods had sent Shiva to make an example, and what the stands were watching, minute by minute, was the god of destruction fighting the fight of his existence. Not toying, not disciplining, not scrubbing a stain, but genuinely fighting, at the peak of his cosmic power, against a thing that met him blow for blow and got, with each exchange, incrementally harder to end. In the Ring of Thrones, the cold goddess had risen to her feet. "Why is he giving ground?" she said, and there was the first thin edge of something in her voice that had not been there before. "Shiva, why is the god of destruction giving ground to?" "He isn't giving ground," said Buddha. The old god had come up into the gallery. No one had summoned him, and no one moved to send him away, because Buddha went where he pleased, and because, just now, no one wanted to be the one to look away from the sand to argue with him. He stood at the rail with his hands folded into his sleeves and watched the storm below with an expression of deep and sober attention. "He's spending," Buddha went on. "Look at the exchanges. Shiva's fire is real. It's marking the demigod. It's costing him. Every blow the destroyer lands does exactly what it's built to do. The problem isn't that Shiva's blows aren't working. The old god's eyes did not leave the fight. The problem is what the blows feed. You've all been watching to see how much damage the demigod can take before he breaks. You're counting it up like a bank balance, waiting for it to run out." He shook his head slowly. "That's not the account you should be watching. Watch the other one. Watch what gets bigger every time Shiva hurts him." And when the gods looked, really looked, past the spectacle of the destroyer's fire to the thing the fire was falling on, they saw it, and several of them went cold. The red light bleeding out of Asura's scars was brighter than it had been at the start of the fight, measurably brighter. It had been a webbing of veins when he fell out of the sky. It was a glow now, pouring off him, lifting off his skin in threads that guttered upward like flame. And it was not the light of a thing being worn down. It was the light of a thing being stoked. Every blow Shiva landed, every raking pass of the unmaking fire, every impact that opened the demigod and made him bleed, went into the furnace and came back out as more. The wrath fed on being struck. That was its nature. The nature the golden heaven had learned too late, 12,000 years ago. You could not beat it down, because beating it down was the one thing guaranteed to make it larger. "He's getting stronger," the cold goddess said, and now the edge in her voice had become something she could not fully hide. "He was always going to get stronger," Buddha said. "The only question was whether Shiva could end him before he got strong enough." And Shiva, the old god's gaze sharpened, is fighting the best fight of his long existence, at the full height of his power, holding nothing back. This is the destroyer with everything out. He turned his mild eyes on the Ring of Thrones, on the assembled majesty of heaven, and there was something almost gentle in the way he delivered the blow. "And it's a fair fight. Even. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Your god of destruction, unleashed completely, is fighting an even fight, with a thing that gets stronger the longer the fight goes on." The silence in the gallery was total. Down on the sand, the two combatants broke apart again, both of them battered now, both bleeding, both grinning through it. And Shiva, chest heaving, forearms low, looked at the demigod across the ruined arena with an expression that had finally, at long last, lost the last of its festival ease. Not because he was losing his nerve, because he had understood the thing Buddha had just said to the gallery, and he had understood it from the inside, in his own fists, in the way each of his best blows bought him a little less than the last. "You feel it too," Asura said. The red poured off him. "The fight's tipping, not fast, but it's tipping. Every time you hit me, I've got a little more, and you've got a little less to hit me with." He rolled his shoulders, and the shape behind him, The vast, burning, many-armed thing the wrath was building toward showed through for a heartbeat, larger than before. That's how it always goes with your kind. You've got a ceiling, a top to what you are. And me, the furnace roared, and the whole arena shuddered with it, and up in the human stands 10,000 mortals felt the heat of it on their faces from 100 feet away. I don't have a top. I've been looking for it for 12,000 years, and I have never once found it. Shiva stood very still for a moment on the bedrock of the arena, at the peak of his power, in the best fight of his existence, and did the arithmetic that Buddha had just done for the gallery, and reached the same answer. And then the god of destruction did the thing that separated him from every proud immortal in the ring of thrones above. He did not despair, and he did not rage, and he did not call for the fight to be stopped. He grinned, a real grin, the biggest one yet, the grin of a god who has spent an age of endings hungry for one fight that would test the absolute limit of what he was, and who has finally, gloriously, found it, even knowing it might be the fight that ends him. Then I'd better stop fighting you, Shiva said, and start destroying you. And he raised all four arms toward the false sky of Valhalla, and the unmaking fire that had wreathed his fists gathered up into them, and kept gathering, drawn from somewhere far deeper than he had yet reached, the true and final office of the god of destruction, the power that ended not a body but a cycle, the dance that shakes a world to pieces. The bedrock of the arena began to crack outward from beneath his feet. The false sky darkened, and across the ruined sand, Asura widened his stance and lifted his own burning fists and welcomed it, the red furnace roaring higher to meet the gathering end, because this was exactly what he had fallen out of the sky to find. Shiva gathered the end of the world into his four hands, and for a moment, all of Valhalla forgot to breathe. It came up out of somewhere the eye could not follow, not from the arena, not from the false sky, but from the deep place where the god of destruction kept the true weight of his office. The unmaking fire that had wreathed his fists was the shallow end of it, a working tool, the destruction a god used for the ordinary ending of ordinary things. This was the other thing. This was the dance the old text spoke of in frightened whispers, the Tandava, the destruction that did not kill a body but shook a cycle to pieces, that reached past a thing's flesh to the fact of its continuing and simply ended the continuing. It gathered in his hands as a sphere of blackness rimmed in unbearable light, small and dense and wrong, a hole punched in the idea of the arena, and the bedrock beneath his feet did not crack toward it so much as lean, as if the ground itself were being drawn toward a thing that wanted to undance the world. In the Ring of Thrones, even the gods who had wanted Asura scrubbed drew back. He's going to use the Tandava, Anubis said, and for once the jackal god's flat scholarly calm had a crack in it, in the arena, against a single opponent, the long muzzle turned toward the others. The seal will hold the grounds together, probably, but if the demigod does not fall to this, he won't fall to it, Buddha said quietly, from the rail. You cannot know that. No, the old god watched the black sphere swell in Shiva's four hands, but I've been watching what feeds him, and I am very much afraid that the god of destruction is about to hand him the largest meal of his existence. Down on the sand, Asura had not moved. He stood in the swept ruin of the arena and watched Shiva gather the end of the world into his hands, and he did not brace, and he did not flee, and he did not reach for any defense. He simply watched, red light pouring off him in threads, and on his scarred face was an expression that made the cold goddess in the Ring of Thrones go still with a dread she could not name. It was not defiance. Defiance she understood. The champions wore defiance. It was something worse. It was anticipation. The demigod was looking at the gathering annihilation the way a starving man looks at a feast, and every god who saw the look understood, in the pit of their deathless being, that they had made a terrible category error somewhere back at the beginning, that they had been asking how much this thing could survive, when the question they should have been asking was how much it could eat. Do it, Asura said. Shiva looked at him across the ruined arena, at the lean burning figure standing wide open, arms low, offering himself to the Tandava, and the last of the god of destruction's uncertainty burned away, because a warrior recognizes another warrior's choice, even when the choice is madness. Asura was not enduring this. He was choosing it. He had looked at the largest thing Shiva could bring, and decided he wanted it aimed straight at him, and there was nothing in that choice but pure, bottomless will, and Shiva loved him for it, even as he prepared to end him. "You beautiful, furious thing," the god of destruction said, and he brought his 4 arms down. The Tandava crossed the arena as a line of pure unmaking, and where it passed, the world simply stopped being. The scorched bedrock along its path did not shatter or burn. It ceased, a clean channel of nothing carved through the floor of the arena, and the air above it collapsed inward with a shriek to fill the space where existence had been withdrawn. It reached Asura in less than an instant and struck him full in the chest. All of it, the entire gathered end of a cycle, poured into a single point on a single body, and the light of it flooded Valhalla white, flooded the human stands, the god stands, the ring of thrones, the whole false heaven, drowning everything in the raw brilliance of a world being shaken apart. For a long moment there was only the light. The mortals in the stands shielded their eyes and could not see. The gods, whose sight was not so easily blinded, watched the point where the demigod had stood and saw only the churning white heart of the Tandava, grinding at the spot, unmaking and unmaking, the destruction of the god of destruction, working at full and final power on a single fixed point. Shiva held all 4 arms extended, pouring it in, holding nothing back, and slowly, throne by throne, the gods let themselves believe it, that this, at last, was enough, that even a thing without a bottom had a top after all, and Shiva had reached it, and the wildcard was being ground out of existence in a channel of pure nothing for the whole of heaven to witness. The cold goddess let out a breath. "Finally," she said, and in the white heart of the Tandava, something moved. It was Buddha who saw it first, because Buddha was the only one in the gallery still watching the way you watch a thing you fear, rather than a thing you hope is dying. He saw the movement in the light, not the frantic thrashing of something being unmade, but a slow, deliberate, rising motion, a figure standing up straight into the full flood of the annihilation, as a man stands up into a hard rain, and the old god's hands tightened in his sleeves. "There," he said softly, "there it is." The light did not fade. Shiva was still pouring it in, but through the white, growing brighter than the white, a red glow began to bleed, and it was not the guttering red of the veins Asura had fallen out of the sky with, and it was not even the pouring red of the furnace he'd stoked through the earlier exchanges. It was a deeper red, an older red, rising from somewhere far down in the demigod, and it grew until it pushed back the white of the Tandava itself, until the point where Asura stood was no longer a channel of unmaking, but a rising column of wrath, and the god of destruction's ultimate power was breaking around it like surf around a stone. Shiva felt it in his 4 arms. He felt the Tandava, the destruction that ended cycles, the largest thing he was. Meet the thing in the column of red and simply fail to catch, the way a fire fails to catch on a thing that is already burning hotter than the fire. And the god of destruction, at the absolute peak of his cosmic power, holding nothing back, pouring the end of a world into a single point, began, for the first time in an age beyond counting, to strain. "It's not working," the cold goddess said. Her voice had climbed. "Shiva, Shiva, it's not." "He's feeding it to him," Buddha said, not to her, to all of them, quietly, in the tone of a man reporting a thing he had feared and now had to name. "The largest destruction in this heaven, and the demigod is eating it." The old god watched the column of red push the white back, and back, and back. "You've all spent this whole fight asking the wrong question. Not can he survive it. He was always going to survive it. The question was only ever, how much bigger does surviving it make him?" The light broke. It broke all at once, the Tandava collapsing inward and guttering out as Shiva's 4 arms, for the first time in the fight, in the age, in perhaps his entire existence, reached the bottom of what they could give, and found nothing more to pour. The white flooded away, and standing in the channel of unmade nothing, at the center of the arena, wreathed in a red glow so fierce it hurt the eyes of gods, was Asura. He was larger, not vastly, not yet, but unmistakably, measurably larger than the man who had fallen out of the sky, as though the annihilation had been packed into him, and become mass, become presence, become more of him. The scars up his arms had opened into channels of pure red light. A second pair of arms had begun to form at his sides, ghosting into being out of the wrath itself, the first hint of the many-armed shape that lived behind the man. And his face. His face was not the face of a thing that had survived the end of the world. It was the face of a thing that had been fed, that had asked for the largest meal heaven could offer, and been given it, and found it good, and that was now looking across the ruined arena at the god of destruction with a terrible, grateful, rising hunger for more. That, Asura said, and his voice had dropped into something that shook the bedrock, layered now, more than one throat speaking at once, was the best one yet. Shiva stood on the sand, forearms hanging low, chest heaving, and looked at what his ultimate power had built. And the god of destruction, who had come down to the sand hungry for one fight that would test his limit, who had found it, who had thrown the end of a world at it, and watched the end of a world become fuel, did the last thing anyone in the Ring of Thrones expected. He laughed. Not the festival laugh, not the delighted laugh of the hunter, a different laugh, worn ragged at the edges, awed, and utterly without regret, the laugh of a being who understands he has finally met the thing that might actually be his ending, and finds that, against every expectation, he is glad. Of course it was, Shiva said. He straightened and rolled his four shoulders, and though the strain still showed on him, he set his feet again, because a god of destruction does not stop at the sight of a thing he cannot destroy. He simply keeps dancing until the music ends, whoever it ends for. Of course it was. He raised his fists once more, and the ruined arena groaned, and up in the human stands 10,000 mortals began, hesitantly at first and then in a roar that shook the tears, to shout, not the name of a champion, for the thing on the sand had no name they knew, but a sound, a wall of raw mortal voice hurled up at the gods on behalf of the burning thing that had eaten the end of the world and grown. Then let's find out what happens, the god of destruction said, grinning through the strain, when I've got nothing left to feed you, and you've still got room to grow. The gods had been so busy watching Asura grow that they had stopped watching Shiva shrink. It was Anubis who named it, because naming was his office, and because the jackal god could not help but weigh a thing, even when the weighing brought only dread. The Tandava, he said, into the silence of the Ring of Thrones. It is not a blow a god throws twice. It is drawn from the deepest reserve of his nature, the true destruction, the ending of cycles. Shiva has spent it. The long muzzle turned toward the sand, toward the god of destruction standing battered and heaving on the ruined bedrock. He gave it everything, and everything was not enough, and now everything is gone. What stands down there is Shiva at the peak of his skill and his speed and his fury, but the bottom of his well is dry. He has no larger card left to play. And the demigod, Buddha said, has only just begun to find out how deep his own well goes. That was the shape of the fight now, and everyone in the gallery understood it, and understanding it was worse than not. For 6 sections of combat the question had hung open. Could the god of destruction end the thing before the thing grew too large to end? The Tandava had been the answer to that question, the largest answer Shiva had. And the answer had been no, which meant the question was closed, and what remained was no longer a contest with an uncertain end but a countdown. Every exchange from here forward spending down what was left of Shiva, while adding to what there was of Asura, a curve that bent one way only, toward a single inevitable point. But Shiva did not fight like a god who had read the curve. That was the thing the human stands would remember longest, and the thing that made even the proud gods in the Ring of Thrones fall, at last, into an uneasy silence that was almost respect. The god of destruction had spent his ultimate power, and grown no smaller in his own estimation for the spending. He set his 4 feet on the cracked bedrock, and he raised his 4 fists, and he came at the growing demigod with everything that was left, which was not the end of a world anymore, but was still the accumulated skill of an age beyond counting, the speed that had blurred him into after-images, the technique of a god who had been fighting since before the Western pantheons learned to walk. If he could not outpower the wrath, he would outfight it. He would make every exchange cost, would find the angle, would dance the demigod ragged and pray that somewhere in the dancing he found a seam. And for a while, a glorious doomed while, It worked. The fight shifted from a storm into something more intricate and no less violent. Shiva's four arms weaving a defense and an offense at once, striking from angles that even a growing demigod could not cover, opening cuts, landing blows, buying himself the space to strike again. He was not winning. Everyone watching knew he was not winning. But he was fighting, at a level of pure martial artistry that the tournament had not yet seen, and he made the demigod work for every foot of the sand, and the human stands roared for it even as they roared for Asura, because there is a thing in mortals that cannot help but love a doomed defiance fought beautifully, and the god of destruction was giving them the most beautiful doomed defiance any of them had ever seen. "Why?" the cold goddess said, and her voice had changed again, the venom gone out of it, replaced by something baffled and almost frightened. "Why does he keep fighting? He must feel it. He must know. The Tandava was everything, and it failed. Any of us would call for the round to be stopped, would demand the seal remove the thing, would run," Buddha finished. He said it without unkindness, but he said it, and let it sit in the gallery. Yes, any of you would. That's what you don't understand about the being you sent down there. Either of the beings you sent down there. The old god watched Shiva weave through a flurry of the demigod's blows, and land 3 of his own, none of them enough. Shiva keeps fighting because Shiva is the god of destruction, and the god of destruction does not fear an ending, not even his own. He is the one who brings endings. He has always known his dance ends someday, for him too, and he made his peace with that before your Western thrones were carved. Buddha's mild eyes moved along the ring of proud faces. That's why he's the one who volunteered, not the bravest of you, the one who was already free of the thing the rest of you are only now beginning to feel. He turned back to the sand. Fear, of a power that judges you for once, of sitting on the wrong side of the vote. The gallery did not answer him, because there was no answer. Down on the sand, Asura took another of Shiva's beautiful doomed exchanges, took it and grew, and something in him that had been pure wrath since he fell out of the sky began, for the first time, to shade toward something else. He caught Shiva's 4 wrists in his own 2 hands, mid-flurry, and held them, and the 2 of them stood locked in the center of the ruined arena, straining, faces close, and the demigod looked into the eyes of the god of destruction and saw the thing Buddha had already named, not fear, but the absence of it, the clean, unafraid acceptance of a being who had made peace with endings long ago. "You're not like them," Asura said, low, layered, the growing red glow pouring off him and washing over them both. "The ones up there, the ones I came to break. You know what you are. You know it ends, even for you." His grip tightened. The bedrock cracked beneath their locked feet. "You're not fighting me because you think you'll win. You knew you wouldn't win when your Tandava fed me instead of ending me. You're fighting me because it's a good fight," Shiva said, grinning through the strain, blood running down his face. "The best one, the last one maybe, and what a way to go." He heaved against the demigod's grip and could not break it, and laughed anyway. "You spend an age ending things, boy. An age. And you start to wonder if anything out there is big enough to end you. If you'll ever get to be on the other side of it. Just once. Just to know what it's like." His 4 arms shook in Asura's grip. "And then a furious thing falls out of the sky and eats your Tandava and grows, and you realize, oh, there it is. The thing that's bigger than my dance." The grin turned fierce and glad, and utterly unafraid. "Why in all the worlds would I run from that? I've been waiting for it for an age." And Asura, the demigod of wrath, whose entire 12,000-year existence had been built on the fury of being judged and cast down by gods who felt nothing when they did it, found, holding the wrists of a god who was glad to meet his own ending, that the furnace in him did something it had not done in a very long time. It banked. Not out, never out, but down. For a moment, the roaring red glow dimming to something that was still fury but had, threaded through it now, a strand of something almost like grief. Because Asura had come to Valhalla to break gods, and he had meant it, and he would do it, but he had not expected, in the breaking, to find one that he liked. One that did not lie. One that sat on the wrong side of the vote the same as the rest and yet was somehow not the same at all, because it did not pretend, because it knew what it was, and knew what it did, and did not dress the ending up in pretty holy words, Shiva was going to lose. They both knew it now. And Shiva was going to lose well, without a single lie. And there was a strange, terrible dignity in it that the golden heaven of Asura's memory had never once shown him. "When this is done," Asura said, and his voice had gone quieter. The layered thunder of it softened. "The rest of them up there. The ones who sent you down here to die, so they wouldn't have to. The ones who dressed their genocide up as a fair fight." His grip did not loosen, but his eyes lifted, past Shiva's shoulder, up to the ring of thrones where the proud gods of the West sat watching their champion spend himself against a thing they were too afraid to face. "They're the ones I came for, not you." The red glow flared back up, and behind him the ghost shape of the many-armed thing swelled larger, and the countdown that everyone in Valhalla could feel ticked one number closer to its end. "So do me a favor, God of Destruction. Give me your best. All of it. Everything that's left." His two hands tightened on Shiva's four wrists, and the bedrock screamed, "Make me earn this, so that when I turn around and look at them, they understand exactly what it cost to put you down, and exactly how little it's going to cost me to reach them next." Shiva looked at the demigod holding his wrists, and understood the gift he was being offered, not mercy. The demigod had no mercy in him for gods, but respect, the respect of an ending that meant something, a loss that would be spent as a message to the ones who deserved to receive it. And the god of destruction threw back his bleeding head and laughed one last time, ragged and delighted and free. "Now that," Shiva said, "is a good death." And he tore his four wrists loose. Asura let him. That was the thing. The demigod opened his hands and let the god pull free for one final pass. And the god of destruction gathered up every last scrap of skill and speed and fury he had left in him. All of it. The whole of what remained of the peak of his cosmic power. And hurled himself at the growing demigod of wrath for the final exchange of round 5. Grinning, unafraid, and utterly, gloriously spent. The final exchange was not a storm. It was a duet. That was how the mortals who survived to tell of it would describe it, groping for words, because what happened in the center of the ruined arena in those last moments did not look like the earlier fighting. The storm had been two beings hammering to find out who broke first. This was two beings who both already knew the answer, and had stopped fighting to survive, and started fighting to mean something. And there is a difference in the way a body moves when it has given up on living, and given itself entirely to the blow it is throwing. Shiva came in with everything left, 4 arms weaving the last and most beautiful pattern of his long existence, and Asura met him, and for a span of moments, that the watching gods would never be able to measure, the two of them traded blows at a level that transcended the tournament, transcended the arena, transcended the entire small question of who would win round 5. The god of destruction, spent and bleeding and unafraid, fought the way a master fights when the mastery is all he has left, and the demigod of wrath, grown huge now with a second pair of arms fully formed and a third ghosting into being, fought down to meet him, held back the annihilating scale of what he had become, so that the god's last exchange would be a fight and not an execution, so that Shiva would get to spend himself against something worthy and not simply be swept aside. It was a mercy. It was the only mercy Asura had in him, and he gave it not because Shiva was a god, but because Shiva, alone of all of them, had refused to lie, and even a furnace of 12,000-year wrath can recognize the one honest thing in a heaven full of pretty falsehoods, and choose to honor it. "You're holding back," Shiva gasped, mid-exchange, 4 fists hammering into a demigod who took them and did not break. "For me, you furious, sentimental." He laughed, and blood came with it. "I could kiss you." "Don't," Asura rumbled, and there was, buried under the layered thunder, the barest ghost of something that might once, long ago, before the golden heaven took everything, have been humor. Just fight. And Shiva fought. He fought until there was nothing left to fight with, until the last of the skill and the speed and the divine fury had poured out of his 4 arms and into the demigod who kept absorbing it, kept growing, kept meeting him. And then, at the very end, when the god of destruction had spent the final scrap of what he was, he did the last thing a spent god could do. He stopped weaving. He drew all 4 arms back at once, and he threw a single blow. Not fast, not clever, no technique left in it at all. just the whole of everything he had ever been poured into one honest fist, aimed straight at the center of the burning thing in front of him. It was the best blow Shiva had ever thrown. It was the best blow, some in the human stands would swear ever after, that had been thrown in the whole of Ragnarok, and it landed clean, square on the demigod's chest, with the full and final weight of the god of destruction behind it. Asura took it, rocked back half a step, and did not fall. "Beautiful," the demigod said, and meant it. And then, because the exchange was over, and the god was spent, and there was nothing left in all of Valhalla that could feed the fight any longer, Asura straightened to his full-grown height, the second pair of arms spread wide, the third fully formed now, the red glow pouring off him and turning the whole ruined arena the color of a forge, and looked down at the god of destruction standing empty and swaying before him, and understood that the moment had come to end it. He did not want to rush it. That was the strange thing, the thing that made the watching gods go silent and made even Brunhild, up on the lip of the stands, press a hand to her mouth. The demigod of wrath had come to Valhalla to break gods, and here was a broken god before him, spent and finished and ripe for the ending, and Asura did not gloat, and he did not roar, and he did not draw it out. He simply looked at Shiva for a long moment, with the red furnace pouring off him, and something passed between the two of them that had no words in it, the mutual recognition of two beings who had both been thrown down, and both refused to stay down, one of whom was about to stay down at last, and was glad. "Any last words?" Asura said, "for the ones up there?" His eyes did not leave Shiva, but everyone in the Ring of Thrones knew who the ones up there were, and several of them looked away. "You've got a captive audience, the whole of heaven's watching. Say what you want them to hear." Shiva stood swaying on the ruined bedrock, forearms hanging spent, blood running freely down a body that had given everything, and he considered the offer with the seriousness it deserved. Then the god of destruction lifted his head and turned it, slowly, painfully, up toward the Ring of Thrones where the proud gods of the West sat frozen in their seats. And when he spoke, his voice had lost all its festival music and become something plain and clear and terrible in its plainness. "You sent me down here," Shiva said, "up at the gods who had chosen him to be their example, because you were afraid, all of you. You felt this thing fall out of the sky, and you knew, the way you know a storm before it breaks, that it was bigger than you. And rather than face it yourselves, you dressed it up. It's Shiva's round anyway, let the destroyer scrub the stain. And you sent me to die so you wouldn't have to learn what I'm about to learn." He coughed, and blood came, and he grinned through it one last time, up at the frozen faces. "So learn it from me, from over here, from the wrong side of the vote." His voice dropped, and every soul in Valhalla leaned in to catch it. "You are not the biggest thing anymore. You haven't been, for a while. You just hadn't met the thing that's bigger, until now." He looked back down at Asura, and the grin turned gentle, and unafraid, and free. "I have, and I'm the lucky one. Because I get to go out fighting it. And you," the last word he threw back up at the thrones like a blade, "you get to go out watching." And then the god of destruction turned his back on the gods who had sent him to die, and faced the demigod of wrath, and spread all four arms wide, open, undefended, offering, and said quietly, so that only Asura heard it, "Make it a good one. I've earned that much." "You have," Asura said. The blow that ended round 5 did not shake the arena. That was the thing the mortals could never quite explain afterward. Every other exchange in the fight had cracked the bedrock and blasted the air and set the false sky flickering. And this one, the final one, the one that ended the god of destruction, was almost quiet. Asura drew back one of his four arms, and there was no wrath in the motion, no fury, none of the roaring hatred he carried for the gods above. There was only a kind of terrible tenderness, the care a warrior takes with the ending of the one opponent who fought him honestly. And he struck once, clean, straight through the center of the god of destruction, and Shiva's spent and grinning and utterly unafraid form came apart into motes of unmaking light that drifted up into the false sky of Valhalla and were gone. The arena was silent. For one long moment, nobody in all of heaven moved. The scoreboard hung overhead. The divine tally, which had read gods 2, humanity 2, Since the fall of Heracles, the tally that round 5 had been called to change, to swing to God's 3 and push humanity one death closer to extinction, did not move either, because the thing that had won round 5 was not one of humanity's 13. It answered to no side of the board. And the great carved scoreboard of Ragnarök, built by the gods to track a contest with rules, simply had no column for what had just happened, no place to record the death of a god at the hands of a thing that was not a champion, and so it recorded nothing at all, and hung there over the ruined arena, blank and useless and wrong. Asura lowered his 4 arms. He stood alone in the center of the sand where the god of destruction had been, huge now and burning, the red glow of him pouring up into the false heaven, and for a moment, just a moment, the furnace banked again, and something crossed the demigod's grown and monstrous face that was almost grief, because he had come to break gods, and he had broken one, and the one he had broken was the only one in all of Valhalla he would have chosen, given the choice, to leave standing. Then he lifted his head, and he turned. Slowly, deliberately, the second and third pairs of arms spreading wide, the red furnace roaring back up to full and past full, he turned away from the empty sand, and toward the ring of thrones where the proud gods of the West sat frozen in their seats, the ones who had sent Shiva down to die, so they would not have to face what fell out of the sky, the ones who had voted for extinction, and called it a fair fight, the ones he had actually come for, and 10,000 mortals in the human stands, who had watched their whole doomed contest suddenly turn into something with no rules and no ceiling and no lie left in it, rose to their feet as one, and roared, and up on the lip of the tears, Brunhild lowered her hand from her mouth and said, very softly, to the god beside her, "It's not over. Round 5 is decided, but it's not over." "No," Buddha said, watching the demigod turn his burning gaze on the thrones of heaven. "I don't imagine it is." The gods had built Ragnarök so that death would always come one at a time, inside the rules, wearing the costume of a fair fight. What turned toward them now had never agreed to come one at a time, and wore no costume at all. Asura crossed the arena toward the Ring of Thrones without hurry. He did not have to hurry. There was nowhere in all of Valhalla for the gods to go that he could not follow, and every immortal in the tiered assembly understood it in the same cold instant, that the seal which had kept unsanctioned power out of the arena said nothing about keeping a sanctioned killing in, that the walls built to contain the tournament were about to become the walls of a trap, and that the trap had closed around the wrong side. The demigod climbed the ruined bedrock toward the divine box, growing with every step, the third pair of arms fully formed now, and a fourth ghosting into being, and the red furnace of him lit the underside of heaven like a second and angrier dawn. "Stop him," the cold goddess said. Her voice had lost every trace of its glacial contempt. What was left was thin and high and frightened, the voice of a being who has spent an eternity certain of her place at the top of the order, and has just felt the order tip. Someone, Zeus, someone stop him. He's coming. He's actually... "With what?" said Anubis. The jackal god had not risen. He sat in his throne with his black eyes fixed on the ascending demigod, and his long muzzle very still, and there was in his flat voice the terrible calm of a being whose entire office was the honest weighing of things, delivering a verdict he took no pleasure in. Shiva was the god of destruction, the end of cycles, the largest ending in this heaven. He gave the thing everything, the Tandava, the true destruction, the whole of his cosmic office, and the thing ate it and grew. The muzzle turned slowly along the ring of thrones, weighing each god in turn, and finding each one wanting. "So I ask you honestly, as the one among us who cannot lie about a measurement, which of you has a card larger than the one Shiva already played and lost? Which of you carries an ending bigger than the ending of endings?" The black eyes returned to the climbing figure, because that is the size of the blow it would take. "And I do not believe a single one of us is holding it." No god answered. That was the answer. Buddha watched from the rail, and Brunhild watched beside him, and the old god said quietly, "They're doing the arithmetic. All of them, all at once. The thing they never had to do before, because they'd never met a number that didn't come out in their favor." He almost smiled, and did not, because there was nothing to smile about. 7 million years of votes, and it never once occurred to them that the thing they were voting on might vote back. And then Zeus rose. The king of the Olympians rose from his throne, and the ring of thrones went silent, because whatever fear had seized the lesser gods, the Almighty was still the Almighty, the being who had opened Ragnarök by tearing the first man of all creation into red ruin with his bare fists, the god whose casual reach had put a mountain of pressure on the arena in the first minutes of the day. If there was a card left in all of heaven larger than the one Shiva had lost, it sat in the fists of Zeus, and every god in the assembly turned toward him, with the desperate hope of the condemned looking to the one man who might still hold a key. Zeus descended to the sand. He came down not in a stairway of light as Shiva had, but straight, dropping from the divine box to the ruined bedrock with an impact that cracked the arena floor in a fresh ring, and he landed in a crouch and rose to his full mountainous height and looked at the burning many-armed thing climbing toward the thrones, and Asura stopped and turned and looked back at him. The two of them faced each other across the ruined arena, the king of the gods, gold and thunder and absolute confidence, the being at the very top of the divine order, and the demigod of wrath, grown huge and burning, the thing that had fallen out of the sky and eaten the end of a world. "You've done a great deal of damage today," Zeus said, "for a thing that does not belong here." He raised his fists, and the air around them hardened. The Adamas, the divine tempering, the same power that had cracked the shell of the first man. "I underestimated your durability. I will not make that mistake twice. You will not eat my strength the way you ate the destroyers, because I am not going to give you the time to grow into it." The Adamas spread up his arms, gold and terrible. "I am going to end you in a single blow, before you can take another step." "Everyone says that," Asura said. He did not raise his arms. He did not brace. He stood on the ruined bedrock with the red furnace pouring off him, and looked at the king of the gods with an expression that had passed entirely beyond wrath now, into something colder and older, and far more final. The look of a being who has heard "I will end you in a single blow," out of the mouth of a god so many times, across so many ages, in so many pretty golden heavens, that the words no longer even reach the fire. "Every single one of you, right before the end. I am the Almighty. I have the right. I will end you." The fourth pair of arms finished forming, 6 arms now, spread wide, and the shape behind the man swelled until it filled the underside of heaven. 12,000 years, and it's always the same words, out of the same certainty, from the same high place, and it's always, always the same when I hit back. Zeus came at him. The king of the gods crossed the arena in a blur that outstripped even Shiva's opening speed, the Adama's hardened fist drawn back and then thrown with the full and final power of the Almighty behind it. The blow that had cracked the first man, the largest thing at the very top of the divine order, poured into a single strike, aimed at the burning demigod's skull. It was, by every measure the gods possessed, the strongest single blow in all of heaven. It was the card Anubis had said no one held. It came faster than sight, and heavier than mountains, and it carried in it the absolute conviction of the highest god in creation, that his power was, and had always been, the final word. Asura caught it. He caught the fist of the Almighty in one of his 6 hands, and the shockwave of the catch blasted outward and flattened what was left of the arena and staggered the gods in their thrones. But the demigod did not move. He stood on the ruined bedrock with the strongest blow in heaven caught in a single hand, the Adamas grinding against his grip and failing to crack it, and he looked at Zeus down the length of the god's own straining arm, and the red furnace of him roared up brighter, and he said, very quietly, the words that ended the reign of the divine order over the arena of Ragnarok. "Is that all?" And then he closed his hand. The Adamas, the divine tempering that could crack the shell of a world, the pride and the power of the king of the gods, shattered in Asura's grip like cheap glass, and Zeus's eyes went wide, and for the first time in the whole span of Ragnarök, for perhaps the first time in the whole span of his deathless existence, the Almighty felt at the end of his own arm a thing larger than himself. The demigod's grip tightened, and the god of thunder was hauled off his feet, off the ground, up into the air, held at the full extension of a single one of 6 burning arms, like a thing a child has caught and is deciding what to do with. And all of heaven watched the king of the gods dangle, and understood that the order was over, that the number had come out at last on the other side, that the thing they had voted to erase had grown, in the space of a single afternoon, past the reach of every power they had. Asura did not kill him. That was the thing that would echo through Valhalla longest, that the demigod of wrath held the king of the gods helpless at arm's length, with the whole of heaven watching, and did not close the last of the distance. He held Zeus up before the ring of thrones, before the frozen gods, before the 10,000 roaring mortals, and he turned slowly, so that every immortal in the assembly could see their almighty dangling powerless in a single hand. And he spoke, not to Zeus, but past him, up and out, to the whole of the divine order that had sat in judgment over the small and the mortal for 7 million years, and called it holy. "I'm not going to kill your king," the demigod said, and his layered voice filled the ruined arena and every corner of heaven. "You just make another one. That's what your kind does. You lose one, you carve a new one, and you keep on voting." He lifted Zeus higher, and the king of the gods hung there, straining and helpless and, this above all, afraid. The fear of the deathless discovering at last that they are not the largest thing after all. "I'm going to do something worse. I'm going to leave you all alive and watching, and knowing that the biggest thing in your heaven just held your almighty over the sand with one hand and chose to set him down. Knowing that the only reason any of you are still breathing is that I decided you were." The furnace roared. "Live with that. Vote on that. The next time you sit up high and decide who gets to exist." And he opened his hand and let Zeus fall, the king of the gods dropping to the ruined bedrock and catching himself on his hands and knees, alive, whole, and unmade in every way that mattered. And the demigod of wrath turned his back on the fallen almighty and the frozen thrones, and lifted his burning gaze to the human stands, where 10,000 mortals stood roaring on their feet, and for the first time since he fell out of the sky, the fire in him banked all the way down, and something on his monstrous grown face softened toward the small living things he had come, across 12,000 years, and to fall through the roof of heaven, to stand between the executioner and the condemned for. In the end, it was the scoreboard that told the truest story, by having nothing to say at all. It hung over the ruined arena as the dust settled, the great carved tally of Ragnarök, god steel and mortal iron, and it read what it had read since the fall of Heracles. Gods too, humanity too. It had not moved when Shiva died. It could not move now. The machine the gods had built to track a contest with rules had been handed a thing with no rules in it, and it sat there blank and honest above the wreckage, a monument to the exact moment the divine order lost the ability to measure what was happening to it. Every god in the Ring of Thrones looked up at that unchanged tally and understood the horror of it. They had won nothing. They had lost nothing. The board said the trial stood even, and the board was a lie now. The way everything the gods had built was a lie, because everyone in Valhalla knew that whatever had just happened on the sand had ended the tournament far more completely than any number the board could hold. Zeus knelt on the bedrock where Asura had dropped him, and did not rise. That too would be remembered, the Almighty, King of the gods, the being who had opened the trial by tearing the first man apart, kneeling on the ruined sand, alive because a thing that fell out of the sky had decided he could be, and knowing it, and knowing that every god in the assembly had watched him know it. He would rise, eventually. He would carve his pride back together the way gods always did, but something had gone out of the divine box that afternoon that would not come back, and every immortal in the tears could feel the absence of it, the way you feel the absence of a sound that has been going so long you forgot it was there until it stopped. In the human stands, the roaring had not died. If anything, it had grown. 10,000 mortals on their feet, and the sound they made was not the sound of a crowd cheering a champion. It was something older and rawer, the sound of a condemned people who had just watched, for the first time in 7 million years, the thing that judged them get judged in turn. They did not fully understand what they had seen. They did not need to. They had seen a god held helpless over the sand and set down alive, and they had heard the thing that held him tell all of heaven to live with the knowing, and something had shifted in them that no defeat in a later round could shift back. Brunhild stood on the lip of the tears and watched her people roar, and for once did not try to temper it, did not reach for the careful rationing of hope that had been her whole strategy for 4 rounds. There was no rationing a thing this size. "It doesn't fit the board," she said quietly, to the god beside her. He won round 5, and the board can't record it because he isn't ours. He humbled the Almighty, and the board can't record that either, because there's no round for it. She shook her head slowly. The gods spent 7 million years building a machine that only measures the things they allow, and he walked in and did the one thing the machine has no number for. He made them afraid, and there's no column for fear. There never is, Buddha said. That's why it works, when it comes. The old god watched the demigod standing at the center of the wreckage, the red furnace of him banked low now, the many arms drawn in, the monstrous grown shape slowly settling back toward the lean, scarred man who had fallen out of the sky. He didn't come to win their trial, Valkyrie. I told you that at the start. He came to send a bill, and he's sent it. Buddha's mild eyes moved up to the Ring of Thrones, to the frozen gods, to the kneeling king. Whether they ever pay it is their affair. But they'll never again sit up high and vote on the small ones without remembering the afternoon the small ones' champion held their almighty in one hand. That memory is the bill, and it doesn't come due once. It comes due every 1,000 years, every time they gather to decide, forever. Down on the sand, Asura looked up at the human stands one last time. He had come to Valhalla out of a wrath 12,000 years deep, and he had spent it the way he always spent it, against the exact kind of high and shining thing that had thrown him down, and called it holy. But standing now in the wreckage, with the fire banked and the roaring mortals filling his ears, the demigod's face wore something that had not been on it when he fell through the roof of heaven. Not peace. He did not have the shape for peace. The golden heaven had burned that out of him long ago. But something adjacent to it, the look of a being who had, for one afternoon, stood exactly where he had always wished someone had stood for him, between the ones who decide and the ones they decide about, and had not been thrown down for it, and had not been alone. He lifted one hand toward the human stands, not a wave. A demigod of wrath does not wave. It was more like an acknowledgement, one weary fighter to the 10,000 small living things he had chosen, and the roar that came back down at him shook what was left of the arena. And then the point of light opened again in the false sky, the same hard white point he had fallen through, waiting now to take him back out, because a thing that fits no side of the board does not stay at the table when its hand is played. Asura looked up at it. He looked back at the human stands, and at Brunhild on the lip of the tears, and at the old god beside her, who had understood him from the first. And last of all, he looked at the Ring of Thrones, at the frozen gods and the kneeling king, and he held their eyes for a long, deliberate moment, long enough that every immortal in heaven felt the weight of being seen by the thing that had humbled them. Every 1,000 years, the demigod of wrath said, up at the gods who decided. That's your cycle, isn't it? Every 1,000 years you gather, and you vote, and you decide whether the small ones down there get to keep breathing. The red in his eyes came up one last time, banked but not out, never out. I heard you this time, all the way from where I was. That's how I fell through your roof. He let it sit. So here's the only thing I came to say, and I'll say it plain, so even a god can't dress it up into something prettier. I can always hear it. Every 1,000 years, when you gather to decide, somewhere, I'll be listening. And if the vote ever comes out the way it came out this time, the furnace flared, and the whole of heaven flinched, I'll fall through your roof again, and I'll be bigger. He did not wait for an answer. There was no answer a god could give. The demigod of wrath rose off the ruined bedrock, up toward the waiting point of light, the red glow of him trailing into the false sky like a comet in reverse, and the last thing all of Valhalla saw of him was his silhouette against the white, lean and scarred and burning, a thing that fit no side of any board, rising back out through the roof of a heaven that would never again be quite so certain of its right to decide. The light closed behind him, and he was gone. The arena was silent for a long moment. Then, very slowly, in the human stands, the roaring began again, and this time it did not stop. The gods did not call round 6 that day, or the next. In the ruined arena where the scoreboard still hung frozen at 2 and 2, the divine order sat in its thrones and did a thing it had not done in 7 million years. It hesitated, because the trial had been built on a certainty, that the gods held the largest power, that their judgment was the final word, that the worst humanity could do was die well inside the rules. And a thing had fallen out of the sky and eaten the end of a world, and held the Almighty in one hand and set him down alive, and taken all three of those certainties with it when it left. Brunhild understood what it meant, and did not say it aloud, because saying it might break the fragile new thing in the air. The gods were still ahead in every way that the board could measure. 5 rounds remained. Humanity's champions could still fall, one at a time, the arithmetic still running its old cruel way. Nothing about the tally had changed. Everything else had. For the vote that ended the world was a thing the gods cast in the comfort of their certainty, and the demigod of wrath had reached up from below and put his hand around that certainty and shattered it like Adamus in his grip. Somewhere beyond the roof of heaven, a thing that fit no side of any board was listening, and every 1,000 years, for as long as gods gathered to decide the fate of the small, they would remember the afternoon they learned they were not the largest thing after all, and they would wonder, each time the vote came due, whether the roof would hold.